And Conrad and Belly looked at each other like this. I think we all knew that Belly's walls are coming down. In the scene in season 3, episode 11, when Belly and Conrad are touring around Paris, we see Belly slowly start to warm up to the idea of spending the day with Conrad and slowly get used to being around him again. As we saw in the opening scene of the episode, Belly was really surprised and shocked to see Conrad show up in Paris at her apartment, and she seemed kind of cold and standoffish to him from the onset. But we know it was just because she was kind of surprised and freaking out inside. We saw that when she went up to her apartment after greeting him and kind of had a mini freak out in her apartment by herself. So as we know, she agreed to spend the day with him and kind of take him around to some touristy spots. I've seen a lot of people point out how unrealistic their few hours or however long it was of touring Paris was, and how, the locations that they were at weren't really close to each other. So we're just going to kind of skip over the unrealisticness of it all. I think sometimes with television shows or movies or whatever, you just kind of have to suspend reality in order to enjoy it. So the entirety of these scenes don't actually have a lot of dialogue, but it tells us a lot despite that being the case. I loved how Conrad was taking pictures of everything. I mean, we all do that. I do that on vacation and when I'm being a tourist, but something about it was just really endearing and sweet. And as Belly is kind of the main one pointing things out to him, and it seems like she's kind of the one deciding sort of what they do and where they go next, it kind of refers back to something I mentioned in a few of my previous videos about this episode, where Belly is kind of really in the lead in this episode. And that's not the dynamic that her and Conrad have had in the past. It's usually been her following Conrad around, and kind of he's the one who's always sort of taken the lead because she has always been in that position of feeling like she's the one who likes him. I mean, we know he liked her too, but we can see in this episode Conrad literally following Belly around and her kind of pointing things out to him and her telling him where to go. And throughout this entire scene, we see Conrad like stealing these sneaky little glances at Belly, and I just loved it. It was so, I can't stop smiling. And throughout the entirety of this scene, we see Conrad kind of sneaking these little glances at Belly. He's stealing a glance wherever he can. And I just thought it was so cute. I know I say that every scene in this episode was my favorite with Conrad and Belly, and that's simply because every scene with Conrad and Belly in this episode just felt like my favorite. They just kept getting better and better, and I just loved their dynamic. And the one thing I found interesting in this episode was Conrad was kind of his most mature version of himself for a lot of different reasons. He was willing to kind of just let Belly be herself and take the lead, and he wasn't pushy or aggressive, which, like I said, is very mature of him. But he also, in several points in this episode, kind of took on this sort of really endearing boyish quality, and kind of reminded both Belly and us of like the younger version of Conrad. And this is kind of one of the cases where I thought of that, like when he kept stealing these little sort of sly glances at her and would sort of like smile to himself. It just reminded me of sort of like young love, teenagers. It even reminded me a little bit of in season 1, when I know Conrad wasn't like his happiest self in season 1, but it reminded me of a lot of parts from season 1 when him and Belly would kind of be like sneaking these glances at each other. It sort of reminded me of that. So it was just interesting, sort of the juxtaposition with Conrad of me kind of feeling like, okay, he's not only his most mature version of himself, but he's also kind of this like boyish, sweet version of himself around Belly. And I do think Belly brings that out in him. It's kind of like she brings out the best in him, and I think he brings out the best in her too, and we'll see that kind of later in the episode as she warms up. But it was just something that came to mind when I noticed him kind of constantly looking at her out of the corner of his eye. And there's this part when they're on the tour bus that I just absolutely love, when he kind of looks at Belly again, sort of out of the corner of his eye, and Belly sort of notices that he's looking at her, and she kind of looks back at him and does a little bit of like a forced awkward smile. Like we said, she has her walls up, her guard is up. She doesn't fully quite yet understand Conrad's intention with being here. She, I don't think, fully believes at this point that he still loves her enough to kind of come to Paris for her, but that's on Belly's insecurities. But anyway, he's looking at her out of the corner of his eye. He's kind of like holding back this smile to himself. Belly notices him looking at her, and then he remembers the last, I think, like full day that they spent together, which is from season 3, episode 5, the episode with the peach scene, that infamous episode. And I just loved this part of the scene. It was so like beautiful, and there was like this whimsical quality to seeing them on the tour bus with the music playing in the background, and then the slow-mo of him remembering Belly just being so carefree in the car with him. She was doing her classic move where she kind of partially hangs out the window and she's got her hand out the window, and she just looked so like happy and at peace in that moment. So I thought it was great that Conrad was remembering her right then, because the last time they spent that day together, they just had the best day ever. And we know, because, I've already watched through this episode several times, that in this day that they're together in Paris, they end up, again, having the best day ever together. So I just loved that little callback, and I loved that he had that flashback in that moment. And for all the times throughout this episode that Conrad steals these little glances at Belly, for something about this moment when he looked at her just really got me in the feels. Like the way he's looking at her, and then she looks at him, and he kind of quickly looks away, and he, smiles to himself, he averts his eyes. It's just so like unbelievably obvious that he is so smitten by her at that point, and it's just like really fun to watch. And even like as he's watching her in that moment, he did kind of, smile to himself, but then he looks at her sort of intensely at the end and looks down, and it's like he probably has so many emotions running through his mind. He's probably so happy to be around Belly again. He's like taking it all in again. It's kind of like this new version of Belly that he doesn't fully know yet. And when he has that flashback to the day of the peach scene, and like I said, he kind of looks a little bit sad and looks down, it's probably just kind of hitting him all at once how much things have changed, how much has happened in the last year. And also at this point in the episode, he doesn't really know if Belly is going to fully let her walls down and let him in. So I imagine it's all kind of very heavy for him, and he's feeling so many conflicting emotions at once. Okay, and this is another part that I loved when, I don't know, they're pointing out some tourist attraction, and he takes a photo of it with kind of her in there. And she, again, like, notices that's what he's doing. And he kind of like, you know, smiles to himself, or it's sort of like this like shy, awkward smile. And again, like I said, it just reminds me of kind of like a little boy with a crush, but you know, I don't mean that in a way to call him immature. As I said, we saw Conrad be incredibly mature throughout the entirety of this episode. And it's just really, like I said, really cute and sweet to see him obviously having a good time with Belly. And I imagine too, it's sort of like they are very much functioning like a couple on this outing that they're having. I'm not saying they are a couple yet, or that Conrad thinks they are. It's just, it was kind of a reminder of how well they sort of flow together. Like, they don't need a lot of words. They're just kind of enjoying the day together. And again, we know Belly isn't fully comfortable yet. We can kind of see that with the way she has not opened up and she's not totally herself yet. But we do kind of see throughout this scene her loosen up a little bit. Okay, and this next part I love so much. I know, how many times can I say that? I literally say that at every scene. But when they're in the museum and you can see they have like the headphones in, they're listening to the like audio tour guide thing. Belly is mostly looking at the art and Conrad is just looking at Belly. And I love that. And I know so many people have pointed this out, but it's like in a room full of art, Conrad is looking at Belly and that's all he can really focus on. And I just, the way this scene was shot, it was just so beautiful to me with the camera kind of moving around them and showing them at all different angles. And you can kind of see at every angle, Conrad will kind of look away and look at the art for a second, but then his eyes are always drawn back to Belly. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the most, you know, obvious one that we know is that he's in love with her and he like can't take his eyes off of her. He hasn't seen her in a year. He hasn't spent time with her in a long time. And so he's really just kind of taking her in and taking it all in. But I also think there's sort of like this probably feeling of disbelief that he's feeling. Like, I bet he can't believe he's here. Like, he is within 24 hours, he like made this quick decision to come and surprise Belly in Paris. And I think he kind of went back and forth for the last, like several parts of the last few episodes of what to do next with Belly in terms of, you know, he was waiting for her to write back and then he was discussing with Agnes what should he do. And so I do think he's feeling probably a lot of disbelief in his head that he's here and this is real and he is standing next to Belly and they're, you know, in this museum together and like he probably can't sort of like believe what's even happening. And I think he probably knows there's a lot riding on this day. At the beginning of this episode when him and Belly plan to spend the day together, she kind of gives him a timeline for it. She says at 8 o'clock I have plans so I can hang out with you until 8. We know she ends up extending that, but at this point in the episode when you're watching it for the first time, like we didn't know that. And so I think in his mind he had that feeling of so much riding on the next few hours of if he's going to tell Belly how he feels, like what's going to happen, how is he going to leave things off. So I think in this moment where he's studying Belly, it is obviously a huge part of it is, you know, he's in love with Belly and he can't stop looking at her and, you know, he can't believe he's here. But I think there is probably, it looks like he's like really thinking and trying to figure something out. And in that moment, that's kind of what came to my mind is he's probably trying to strategize to himself, like, what is my next move? Like, how do I like play out the rest of the next few hours that we have together? And the best part of it is that Belly is also starting to steal these little glances at Conrad. Like, you know, when he looks away and looks back at the art, she is kind of glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. And we see her do this little smile. And this was the moment where I was like literally cheering. I was like, you can see her opening up and her walls coming down right before our eyes, which I think we knew would happen. But it was like after that opening scene where she was really standoffish towards him. Again, I analyzed that in my previous video. So if you want to go back and check that out, you can. But I don't think it was that she was meaning to be rude to him. She was just shocked and she didn't want to show how affected she was. And we saw that because, like I said, she goes back to her apartment and like freaks out by herself. I think she just didn't want him to see that. She wanted to play it off as being like really cool and collected. But here in this moment where she's starting to, you know, steal more and more glances of Conrad herself and she's sort of smiling to herself, it just like, it kind of reminds us that, okay, this is Conrad and Belly. And even though she was really shocked when he first arrived, I think that they are going to open up to each other. And in this moment where she's looking at him, I think she's having a lot of the same thoughts as Conrad, where, you know, she also has not seen him for a long time and she's trying to figure out who Conrad is today and probably still is grappling with the fact that she can't believe he's here. So this next part I really liked as well.
I'm gonna jump in.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I'm jumping in. No, I keep going.
So it kind of seems like a silly, just like a cute, silly little moment between them. But I think it was kind of almost like the final part in this scene where we see Belly's sort of like walls really start to come down because Conrad is being kind of like I said, like silly and boyish with her. And she actually opens up to it. Like, she doesn't even miss a beat. She's like, yeah, okay. And she kind of laughs and, you know, he goes and pretends he's going to jump in the fountain and he doesn't. And once again, it just reminded me of the two of them kind of being able to just be able to act kind of silly and childlike in a positive way with each other. I saw a little bit of criticism of this episode and just sort of Belly and Conrad as a whole, where some people were saying that they just reverted to their younger selves and they just chose the easy option of being with each other because they liked each other as children. And I disagree with that take on a few different levels. And I want to kind of break down why that is. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that they liked each other as children and now they love each other as adults. And I don't think it means that they have reverted to an immature version of themselves. In their case, I actually think there's a lot of power in being able to be your inner child around somebody, namely your partner. And I think it takes a lot of like trust to be able to do that. And I think by the end of this episode, and we'll see that more as I kind of dive into some other scenes, they are able to do that. But they strike this really wonderful balance, as I mentioned earlier, where they are not sort of just foregoing the current version of themselves. I did not feel like they just reverted to their past selves. I think the two of them found this really beautiful balance of being able to be who they are today. Like, you know, we've mentioned so many times that Belly has changed a lot over the last year. She's grown so much in Paris, and you actually really see it when you go back and watch older episodes. I will admit I am on a rewatch, so I simultaneously am repeatedly rewatching season 3 episode 11, but I'm also rewatching from the beginning. And it is stark, actually, for both of them, for both Conrad and Belly. It is stark to see how much they have changed. They've retained, of course, a lot of their character traits. Like, it doesn't seem like the actors playing them, like Chris, Briny, and Lola Tung, it doesn't seem like they completely changed them, but they managed to, I think, portray it really well, where you can see the maturity of both of them at the end of season 3. And if you compare it to the both of them in season 1, they've both just grown so much. So to be able to strike that balance of being your current mature self, but then also kind of just like let loose and let your childlike self and that side of you that wants to be like funny and silly and play, and to do that around the person that you love is so valuable. And we'll see that also on the rooftop scene, which is going to be my next video, where, you know, we all remember that Belly refers to Conrad reminding her of his 10-year-old self. And to some of the people who sort of criticize that as a negative thing, I was just shocked, because I saw it as quite the positive. I think it could be a negative if neither of them had grown in other ways. But like I said, you want to find that perfect balance when you are with somebody, whether it's a relationship or a friend or whatever, where you can honor who you've always been and kind of let your inner child shine through, but also be yourself as you are today and honor all the growth that you've had up until that point. And in this episode, and in this scene specifically, as we move through the scene, I really saw that with Conrad and Belly. So I really loved the scene. I thought, like I said, I thought it was really cute and fun and whimsical, and it might have seemed like just a fun scene of them touring around with the jaunty music in the background, but it was really powerful. It showed us basically in real time over those few hours that they were out touring around, Belly's walls sort of coming down, the ice thawing, and at the end of this scene, she decides to take Conrad to the rooftop, which is kind of like a sacred place for her in Paris. And like I said, that's going to be the next scene that I analyze in my next video. But I think it's really a culmination of everything that happened in the scene that we just talked about up until that point, right? Because she started out very wary of, you know, the fact that Conrad is here. And by the end of this scene of them touring around Paris, she's deciding to take him to some place that was really like her private personal spot. So she is starting to let him in. The other thing I loved about this whole scene was you just see a lot of this sort of like restraint on Conrad's part. One thing I noticed throughout the entire time of him stealing these glances at Belly, it feels like he really wants to say something to her. It feels like he's almost feeling like he's ready to tell her why he's really here, but he doesn't. You know, these moments where he looks at her and then kind of quickly looks away. I think throughout this entire episode, it's almost like he is building his courage to either, you know, be honest with Belly about why he's there, or kind of like let her bring it up, or let her kind of take the lead on that conversation coming about, which is sort of the way that it actually happens. But it's just really kind of wonderful to see him not just jump straight into it and pressure her or be aggressive with her. That was, I think, one of the best things he could have done. I think he played this just absolutely correctly. Everything he did in this episode, I think he played his cards right with Belly, and he really honored the fact that she needed to come to him, and he honored the fact that he just needed her to like let her own walls down without being pushed into it.